I'm Mabel Liao, 52, a first-generation immigrant who sacrificed everything to give my daughter the American dream. Last month, as I lovingly presented the jade bracelet my grandmother gave me meant for Emma's wedding day, she looked at me with embarrassment and said, "Mom, please don't make this so Asian. It's supposed to be elegant and white." Her words shattered something deep inside me. For 25 years, I'd watched her distance herself from our culture, but this felt like the final rejection of everything I am. What she didn't know was that this bracelet carried a tradition far more powerful than any white dress, and what I did next would teach her the true meaning of heritage, respect, and the price of forgetting where you come from. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt caught between honoring your roots and fitting in, like this video for a story about reclaiming identity and the unbreakable bonds of family tradition. When Emma first called to tell me about Robert's proposal, I cried tears of joy in my empty kitchen. My daughter, my precious girl, was going to be married. After hanging up, I immediately began planning in my mind the tea ceremony, the red silk, the double happiness symbols that would bless their union. I pulled out my recipe box and started making notes for the traditional wedding feast I would prepare. But those dreams began crumbling during our first wedding planning session. Emma arrived at my house with a stack of pristine white invitation samples, each one more elaborate than the last. They were beautiful, I had to admit, but they were also completely void of any trace of our heritage. Elegant script on cream cardstock, minimalist designs with delicate florals, all speaking to a world I had never quite belonged to. "What do you think, Mom?" Emma asked, spreading them across my dining table like a deck of cards. "Robert's mother thinks the ivory ones are most sophisticated." I picked up one invitation, feeling the expensive paper between my fingers. "They're lovely, sweetheart, but perhaps we could incorporate some red accents, or maybe a small double happiness symbol." In the corner, Emma's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't think that would really fit the aesthetic we're going for. We want something timeless and classic." The word timeless stung, as if our traditions, passed down through centuries, were somehow temporary or outdated. I forced a smile and nodded, but inside, something began to ache. Over the following weeks, every suggestion I made was met with polite but firm resistance. The venue she chose was a country club, all white columns and manicured lawns. The flowers would be white, roses and baby's breath. The dress she showed me in magazines was a princess-style gown with a cathedral train. Beautiful, but foreign to everything I had imagined for my daughter's wedding day. "Don't you think," I ventured one afternoon, as we browsed through wedding magazines, "that maybe we could have a small tea ceremony, just for family? Your grandmother would have loved to see that tradition continue." Emma looked up from a page featuring towering white wedding cakes. "Mom, that's sweet, but we're having a cocktail hour instead. Robert's family is used to a certain type of event." Robert's family. Those 3 words had become the standard by which every wedding decision was measured. I had met them only once, at a stiff dinner where I felt underdressed despite wearing my best suit. They were kind enough, but their kindness felt like tolerance, the sort of politeness reserved for people you must accept but don't necessarily embrace. I watched my daughter transform before my eyes, her excitement about the wedding growing in direct proportion to her distance from anything that reminded her of home. The girl who once proudly wore her traditional Chinese dress to school cultural events now seemed embarrassed by the very idea of acknowledging her heritage on what should be the most important day of her life. That night, I held the jade bracelet in my hands and wondered if I had failed her somehow. I remember when Emma was 7 years old, she insisted on wearing her red silk dress to school for International Day. Her teacher had asked students to bring something representing their heritage, and Emma had been so excited, she carefully carried the small collection of red envelopes I had given her Lacey from past Lunar New Year's, each one containing a dollar bill and a wish for good fortune. "Mama, will you tell my class about the dragon?" she had asked that morning, her dark eyes bright with anticipation. I had braided her hair extra carefully, weaving in the small red ribbon she loved. I still have the photo from that day, standing proudly in front of her display, explaining to her classmates how the red envelopes brought luck and how we celebrated the new year with fireworks and dumplings. Her smile was radiant, unashamed, filled with the kind of pride that comes from knowing exactly who you are. Those were the golden years, when our differences felt like treasures rather than obstacles. Every Lunar New Year, Emma would help me prepare the feast, her small hands carefully folding wontons while I told her stories about her great-grandmother's escape from China. She would listen with rapt attention as I described the long journey, the precious few belongings, the hope for a better life. "Tell me about the bracelet again," she would beg, and I would take it from its silk-lined box, letting her hold it carefully while I recounted how it had protected our family through war, famine, and the uncertainty of new beginnings. Emma would trace the smooth jade with her finger, marveling at its deep green color. "When I get married, I'll wear it too," she would declare with the certainty that only children possess. But adolescence brought changes I hadn't anticipated. Around 13, Emma began spending more time with friends whose families had been in America for generations. She started coming home with stories about their vacations to Europe, their weekend houses, their casual mentions of family traditions that sounded nothing like ours. I noticed the shift gradually. First, she stopped wanting to bring homemade dumplings for lunch, asking instead for sandwiches like everyone else. Then she began rolling her eyes when I spoke Chinese to her in public. The final blow came when she was 16, and I suggested she apply for a scholarship specifically for Asian American students. "I don't want to be the Asian kid," she had said, her voice carrying a edge of frustration I had never heard before. "I just want to be normal." Normal. The word cut deeper than any insult could have. I had worked so hard to give her every advantage, to help her succeed in this country that had given us so much. But somewhere along the way, I had failed to help her understand that being Chinese American wasn't something to overcome. It was something to celebrate. I began to notice how she would tense when I spoke with my accent at parent-teacher conferences, how she would quickly change the subject when classmates asked about our family traditions. The girl who had once proudly worn her heritage like a beautiful dress now seemed to view it as an ill-fitting costume she couldn't wait to shed. By college, the transformation was complete. Emma studied business, dated boys with names like Brad and Tyler, and came home speaking in the casual, confident tone of someone who had learned to navigate spaces I had never quite mastered. She was successful, accomplished, everything I had dreamed she would become. But she was also becoming a stranger to herself, though I don't think she realized it yet. The red envelopes sat forgotten in a drawer, and the jade bracelet remained in its box, waiting for a day that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. The jade bracelet came to our family in 1943, during the darkest days of the Japanese occupation. My great-grandmother, Mei, had been the daughter of a prosperous silk merchant in Guangzhou. When the bombs began falling and the soldiers came, she had only minutes to grab what she could carry. She chose the bracelet, not the gold jewelry, not the family papers, not even the silk that had made her family wealthy. She chose the simple jade bracelet her mother had given her on her wedding day, the one that had been blessed by monks and worn by the women in our family for generations. Have a photograph of her from that time, the only one that survived the war. She's standing in front of what remains of their house, her face gaunt but determined, the green jade visible on her thin wrist. Behind her, you can see the destruction, the broken lives, the end of everything they had known. But she's wearing the bracelet, and somehow that makes her look unbreakable. Great-grandmother Malin told me this story when I was Emma's age, her weathered hands holding mine as she placed the bracelet around my wrist. "This jade," she said in Mandarin, "has protected our family through the worst of times. It carries the love of every woman who wore it before you." She told me how she had worn it during the long journey to Hong Kong, how it had caught the light during her wedding to my great-grandfather in a displaced persons camp, how my grandmother had worn it when she gave birth to my mother during the chaos of the Chinese Civil War, clutching it for strength through 18 hours of labor with no doctor, no medicine, nothing but hope, and the smooth comfort of jade against her skin. When my grandmother married, she wore the bracelet with a dress made from parachute silk, the only white fabric they could find in post-war Hong Kong. The photos from that day show a woman who had lost everything but found love, her smile radiant despite the simple ceremony. In a cramped apartment. My mother wore it when she married my father in 1962, just before they left for America. I remember her telling me how she had touched the bracelet during the long flight across the Pacific, drawing strength from the generations of women who had worn it before her. "It reminded me," she said, "that I was not just leaving, I was continuing. I was the next chapter in our story." And then, it was my turn. I wore the bracelet on my wedding day in 1970 in a small ceremony in San Francisco's Chinatown. My husband understood its significance, how it connected me to the women who had made my existence possible. He had kissed my hand where the bracelet rested, acknowledging the weight of history I carried. When Emma was born, I knew the bracelet would be hers someday. I imagined her wedding day, how she would wear it with pride, how I would tell her the stories just as they had been told to me. I pictured her passing it to her own daughter, the tradition continuing unbroken. But traditions, I was learning, are fragile things. They require not just preservation, but active choice. And Emma, it seemed, was choosing a different path entirely. The Whitmore Family Country Club sat on a hilltop overlooking the bay, its white columns and pristine lawns speaking of old money and older traditions. I had never been to a place like this before, where the parking lot was filled with luxury cars, and the staff knew members by name. Robert's mother, Patricia, had suggested we meet there for lunch to discuss the wedding plans. She was an elegant woman in her late 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident posture that comes from never having to question your place in the world. She greeted me with a warm smile and a firm handshake, but I could feel her appraising me, my off-the-rack suit, my accented English, my obvious discomfort in this rarefied environment. "Mabel, how wonderful to finally sit down together," she said, leading me to a table by the windows. "Emma is such a lovely girl. Robert simply adores her." The conversation flowed easily enough at first. We talked about the young couple's careers, their apartment in the city, their plans for the future. But as we discussed the wedding, I began to understand the subtle pressures Emma was facing. "Of course, we'll want to use the club for the reception," Patricia said, cutting into her salmon with practiced elegance. "Robert's grandfather was one of the founding members. It's where all the family weddings have been held." I nodded, though. The thought of our families celebrating in this sterile perfection made my heart sink. "It's beautiful," I managed. "The photographer we use is simply divine. He's done all the society weddings for the past 20 years. He has such an eye for classic elegance." Patricia pulled out her phone to show me photos from recent events. Every image looked like it could have been pulled from a magazine, beautiful, perfect, and completely devoid of anything that might hint at difference or diversity. "Emma mentioned you might want to include some Chinese elements," Patricia said, carefully, her tone suggesting she was navigating delicate territory. "Of course, we want her to feel comfortable, but we also want to maintain the sophisticated atmosphere the club is known for." The word sophisticated hung in the air like a judgment. I understood the subtext. Our traditions were quaint, perhaps, but not quite suitable for the level of elegance they were accustomed to. "I was thinking," Patricia continued, "that perhaps we could find a way to honor your heritage in a more subtle way, maybe a private family moment before the ceremony, something intimate and personal, rather than part of the main event." I felt the familiar ache of being tolerated rather than embraced. This was the America I had navigated for 30 years, the polite smiles that masked the message that who I was, where I came from, was acceptable only in small doses, only when it didn't interfere with the dominant narrative. But what hurt most was seeing how Emma responded to this environment. She fit in so naturally, laughing at Patricia's stories about the club's history, nodding enthusiastically about the wedding plans. When Patricia complimented her on her taste in choosing such a timeless venue, Emma glowed with pride. "You've raised such a poised young woman," Patricia told me as we finished our meal. "She has such natural grace. You must be so proud." I was proud, but I was also heartbroken. Emma had learned to navigate this world by becoming invisible in it, by smoothing away any rough edges that might mark her as different. She had achieved the American dream, but at what cost? During the drive home, I found myself thinking about the country club membership card Patricia had casually mentioned they were considering giving the young couple as a wedding gift. It represented everything Emma wanted: acceptance, status, belonging. But it also represented everything I feared she was losing in the process. The explosion came 3 weeks before the wedding. Emma had arrived at my house with her wedding planning binder, a thick, organized collection of magazine clippings, vendor contracts, and timeline charts that represented months of careful preparation. She spread everything across my dining table with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. I had prepared for this conversation, choosing my words carefully. I wanted to approach the subject of traditions gently, to find a way to bridge the gap between her vision and our heritage. I had even researched ways that other couples had successfully blended cultures, hoping to find suggestions that might appeal to her sense of aesthetics. Emma, I began, as she sorted through seating charts, I've been thinking about the ceremony. Perhaps we could incorporate just one small tradition. The tea ceremony is very meaningful. It's a way to honor the families and ask for blessings. She didn't look up from her papers. Mom, we've talked about this. We have the cocktail hour planned. I know, but this would be different. It's not about the party, it's about respect, about continuity. Your great-grandmother, Mom, please. Emma's voice carried a warning edge. I had learned to recognize, we've been through this. I took a breath and tried again. What if we just had the jade bracelet? You could wear it under your dress. No one would even see it. It would mean so much to me. That's when she finally looked up, her expression a mixture of frustration and something that looked almost like panic. Why can't you understand? This isn't about you. This is my wedding day, and I want it to be perfect. But sweetheart, our traditions are beautiful. They're part of who you are. No. The word came out sharper than either of us expected. Emma stood up abruptly, her papers scattering. They're part of who you are. They're not part of who I want to be. The silence that followed felt like a physical blow. I stared at my daughter, this woman I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, and saw a stranger looking back at me. Emma, what are you saying? She began pacing, her words tumbling out in a rush of pent-up frustration. I'm saying that I've worked my entire adult life to build something for myself. I have a career, I have respect, I have a place in this world that I've earned. And every time you bring up these traditions, these ceremonies, these artifacts from another time and place, you're asking me to risk all of that. Risk what? What could you possibly risk by honoring your heritage? Emma stopped pacing and faced me directly. My credibility, my acceptance, my ability to be taken seriously in a world that already sees me as different. Different isn't wrong, Emma. Maybe not, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. But different is harder. And I'm tired of everything being harder. I felt tears beginning to form, but I pressed on. The bracelet is beautiful, Mom, but it's also too Asian for the wedding I want. Robert's family, his friends, everyone who's important to our future, they're expecting elegance and sophistication. They're expecting something that fits with their world. The words hit me like physical blows. To Asian. As if being Asian was something to be measured and rationed. Something that could overwhelm a space if there was too much of it. So that's what I am to you? I asked quietly. To Asian, Emma's face crumpled slightly, as if she realized how her words had sounded. Mom, that's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? She was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her scattered wedding plans. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I meant that I want to fit in. I want to belong. And sometimes, being proud of where we come from makes that impossible. After she left that day, I sat alone at my dining table, surrounded by the detritus of her perfect wedding plans. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry for the little girl who had once worn red silk with pride, for the traditions that were dying with my generation, and for the failure I felt as a mother who had somehow taught her daughter that who she was wasn't good enough. The Buddha temple on Grant Avenue had been my refuge during the hardest times of my life when my husband died. When Emma was struggling in school, when the weight of being between two worlds became too much to bear alone. The familiar scent of incense and the soft murmur of prayers in multiple languages always brought me peace. I found Mrs. Wang in the courtyard, her weathered hands moving smoothly across her prayer beads. At 83, she had been the temple's unofficial counselor. For decades, the woman other immigrants came to when American life felt too complicated to navigate alone. She looked up as I approached, her eyes immediately recognizing my distress. Mabel, she said in Mandarin, patting the bench beside her, you look like a woman carrying too much weight. I sat down gratefully and pulled out my own prayer bead, simple string of wooden beads my mother had given me when I first arrived in America. The familiar weight of them in my hands was comforting. My daughter is getting married, I began. Mrs. Wang smiled. That should be a celebration. She doesn't want any part of our traditions. She says they're too Asian for her wedding. The older woman was quiet for a moment, her fingers continuing their rhythmic movement across her beads. Around us, the city noise faded into the background, replaced by the peaceful sounds of the temple garden. I have seen this many times, Mrs. Wang finally said. The children who grow up here, they think they must choose. Be American or be Chinese. They don't understand that they can be both. I don't know what I did wrong. I tried to give her everything, opportunities, freedom to choose her own path. But somehow she learned to be ashamed of where she came from. You did nothing wrong, Mrs. Wong said firmly. This is the burden of the first generation. We sacrifice so our children can have better lives, but sometimes they think better means forgetting who they were before. I thought about Emma as a child, so proud of her heritage, so eager to share our traditions with her friends. She used to love our culture. I don't understand what changed. The world changed her, Mrs. Wang said simply. She learned that being different requires explanation, defense, justification. It's easier to blend in than to constantly educate others about who you are. So what do I do? Do I let her have her white wedding and say nothing? Do I watch our traditions die with me? Mrs. Wang stopped her prayer beads and turned to face me directly. You remind her of her strength, not by forcing traditions on her, but by showing her the power of knowing who she is. The jade bracelet you mentioned, it's not just jewelry. It's proof that she comes from a line of survivors. She doesn't want to hear about the bracelet, then don't tell her about the bracelet. Show her what it represents. Show her that being Asian isn't something to hide from. It's something that made her strong enough to succeed in any world she chooses. As I left the temple that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Mrs. Wong was right. It was time to stop asking Emma to remember her heritage and start showing her why it mattered. That night, I pulled out the old trunk I kept in my bedroom closet, the one filled with documents, photographs, and memories I had carefully preserved over the years. I hadn't opened it in months, but now I spread its contents across my bed like a detective gathering evidence for the most important case of my life. The genealogy scroll was the centerpiece, a document my father had painstakingly recreated from memory after fleeing China. Written in elegant calligraphy, it traced our family line back 12 generations, through dynasties and wars, famines and triumphs. Each name represented a life lived, a story worth telling, a link in the unbroken chain that led to Emma. I studied the names of the women in our family there. Chinese characters beautiful even when I struggled to read them. Here was Chun Meihua, who had managed her family's rice fields during a 3-year drought. There was Li Zhulin, who had hidden refugees during the Baktun Rebellion. Each woman had faced impossible circumstances and found a way forward. Next, I examined the photographs, some so old they were more brown than black and white. My great-grandmother Maylin appeared in several, and I could trace the jade bracelet through the images like following a thread through a maze. In one photo, she wore it while holding my grandmother as a baby. In another, my grandmother wore it on her own wedding day, standing beside my grandfather in their simple ceremony. I found my parents' immigration papers, stamped and official, documenting their arrival in San Francisco in 1955. The language was bureaucratic and cold, but these documents represented the courage it took to leave everything familiar and start over in a country where they couldn't even read the street signs. There were letters to correspondence between family members, scattered across different continents, maintaining connections despite impossible distances. My mother had saved every letter from relatives in Hong Kong and Taiwan, preserving news of births, deaths, successes, and struggles. But the most powerful discovery was a folder I had forgotten about: news clippings about Chinese Americans who had made significant contributions to their communities. Scientists, artists, business leaders, politicians, all of them people who had succeeded not by hiding their heritage, but by drawing strength from it. I spent hours reading these stories, taking notes, preparing what I now realized would be the most important presentation of my life. Emma needed to understand that being Chinese American wasn't a limitation to overcome, it was a source of power she had never fully appreciated. I researched successful fusion weddings, finding examples of ceremonies that honored multiple traditions without compromising elegance or sophistication. I documented the meaning behind each element of Chinese wedding traditions, not as outdated customs but as symbols of values that transcended culture: respect for family, hope for the future, the joining of two lives in partnership and love. Most importantly, I prepared the story I would tell, not just about the jade bracelet, but about the remarkable women who had worn it, women who had survived wars, crossed oceans, built new lives from nothing, and passed their strength down through generations. By dawn, I had a plan. I would invite both families to dinner, Robert's parents and Emma and Robert themselves. But this wouldn't be just a social gathering. This would be Emma's education in her own extraordinary heritage, whether she wanted it or not. I called Emma the next morning with a carefully casual tone. "Sweetheart, I was thinking it would be nice to have both families over for dinner before the wedding, a chance for everyone to get to know each other better." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mom, we don't really have time for just one evening," I interrupted gently. "I know how busy you are with final preparations, but Robert's parents have been so generous with the wedding planning, and I'd like the chance to properly welcome them to our family." I could hear Emma's reluctance, but also her inability to argue with what sounded like a reasonable and gracious gesture. "I suppose that would be nice," she finally agreed. "When were you thinking?" "This Saturday evening. Nothing formal, just a family dinner." After I hung up, I spent the rest of the week preparing with the kind of meticulous attention I usually reserved for the most important occasions. I polished my grandmother's mahogany dining table until it gleamed, the same table where Emma had done her homework as a child, where we had celebrated every birthday and holiday for the past 25 years. I carefully selected the dishes I would serve, not just any Chinese food, but specifically the recipes that told our story. The steamed fish with ginger and scallions that my great-grandmother had taught my grandmother during those difficult years in Hong Kong. The braised pork belly that my mother had adapted for American ingredients when she first arrived. The sticky rice cakes that had been served at every family wedding for generations. Each dish would be accompanied by its story, its significance, its connection to the people who had shaped our family's journey. This wasn't going to be just dinner, it was going to be an immersive experience in Emma's heritage. I arranged the artifacts I had gathered strategically around the dining room. The genealogy scroll would be displayed on the sideboard, visible but not ostentatious. The old photographs would be arranged on the mantel, casual enough to invite conversation. The jade bracelet would remain in its silk box until the right moment. Saturday afternoon, I set the table with my best china, the porcelain tea set that had been my mother's wedding gift to me. Each piece painted with delicate peonies and gold trimmed. It was beautiful enough to meet Patricia Whitmore's standards of elegance, but distinctly Chinese in its artistry. I dressed carefully too, choosing a deep blue silk blouse that my mother had bought for me in Hong Kong decades ago. It was elegant and sophisticated, but unmistakably influenced by Chinese design. I wanted to look like a woman proud of her heritage, not someone trying to hide from it. When Emma arrived early to help with final preparations, I could see her taking in the changes to the familiar room. Her eyes lingered on the photographs, the scroll, the careful arrangement of cultural elements she hadn't seen displayed so prominently in years. "Mom, what's all this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "It's our family story," I said simply. "I thought Robert's parents might be interested in learning a little about where you come from." Emma's expression tightened. "Please tell me you're not planning to lecture everyone about Chinese history all evening." "I'm planning to share some stories about our family," I replied. "Stories I think you might have forgotten." When the doorbell rang an hour later, I took a deep breath and went to welcome the Whitmores. Patricia looked elegant as always, and Robert's father, James, carried a bottle of expensive wine. Robert seemed relaxed and happy, and Emma hovered nervously behind them, clearly unsure what to expect from the evening ahead. As I led them into the dining room, I noticed Patricia's eyes taking in the cultural elements with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than judgment. Perhaps this evening would unfold differently than I had dared to hope. The first hour passed pleasantly enough, with the kind of polite conversation that occurs when people are still taking each other's measure. James Whitmore complimented the wine I had selected, a decision I had agonized over, wanting something that would pair well with Chinese flavors while meeting his sophisticated palate. Patricia admired the table setting, her fingers tracing the delicate pattern on the porcelain teacup at her place. "This china is exquisite," she said. "The craftsmanship is remarkable." "Thank you," I replied, pouring tea with the measured grace my mother had taught me decades ago. It was made in Jingdezhen, the porcelain capital of China. My mother bought the set for my wedding, though she had to save for 2 years to afford it. I caught Emma's quick glance across the table, a warning look that suggested I should keep the conversation light. But I had no intention of keeping anything light this evening. "The pattern represents peonies," I continued, "which symbolize honor and wealth in Chinese culture. But more than that, They represent the hope that prosperity will bloom in the new marriage. Robert leaned forward with genuine interest. I had no idea there was so much symbolism in everyday objects. That's fascinating. Everything in Chinese culture has meaning, I said, beginning to serve the first course. Food, colors, numbers, even the way we arrange furniture, it all tells a story. The steamed fish arrived at the table with its garnish of ginger and scallions, the sauce fragrant with soy and rice wine. I watched as Patricia took her first careful bite, her expression shifting from polite interest to genuine appreciation. "This is delicious," James said. "The flavors are so clean and complex at the same time." "It's my great-grandmother's recipe," I explained. "She taught it to my grandmother during the war, when they had very little to work with. The technique is simple, but it requires patience and respect for the ingredients." Emma was eating quietly, her posture tense, clearly waiting for me to say something embarrassing or inappropriate. But I had learned subtlety over the years, and I knew how to plant seeds without appearing to lecture. "Emma, remember when you were little, how you loved to watch me prepare this dish?" I asked. "You would stand on a chair next to the stove and insist on arranging the ginger slices yourself." "I remember," Emma said softly, though her tone suggested she wished she didn't. "You were so precise about it," I continued, addressing the table generally. Even at 5 years old, she understood that the presentation mattered as much as the flavor. I used to tell her that cooking was our family's first art form. Patricia smiled. "Robert tells us Emma is wonderfully creative. It sounds like that started early." I served the braised pork belly next, explaining how my mother had adapted the traditional recipe when she first arrived in America, substituting ingredients that were available in San Francisco's Chinatown in the 1950s. The conversation flowed more easily now, with James asking thoughtful questions about Chinese cooking techniques, and Patricia expressing genuine curiosity about the immigrant experience. "It must have been incredibly difficult," Patricia said, "coming to a new country without speaking the language, without family nearby to help." "It was," I agreed. "But that's what made the traditions so important. Food was one of the few ways we could maintain our connection to home. Each recipe carried memories, stories, the taste of everything we had left behind." Emma was watching me now with an expression I couldn't quite read, part wariness, part curiosity, as if she was seeing me differently than she had in years. The sticky rice cakes were served with fresh fruit and a light syrup flavored with osmanthus flowers. As I explained the significance of sticky rice in Chinese weddings, how it represented the hope that the couple would stick together through all of life's challenges, I noticed Robert reaching for Emma's hand under the table. "That's beautiful," he said, "the idea that every element of the celebration has meaning and purpose." I caught Emma's eye across the table. "Our ancestors believed that marriage wasn't just about two people falling in love. It was about creating a bridge between families, between past and future." The moment felt suspended, full of possibility, and I realized it was time to begin telling the story I had really brought everyone here to hear. As I cleared the dinner plates, I moved to the sideboard where I had placed the genealogy scroll and the collection of old photographs. The conversation had reached that comfortable lull that occurs after a good meal, when people are relaxed and open to whatever comes next. "I hope you'll indulge me," I said, returning to the table with a small wooden box. "I wanted to share something that I think might interest you, the story of how our family came to America." I opened the box carefully, revealing the war-torn marriage certificate that had somehow survived bombing, displacement, and decades of careful preservation. The paper was yellowed and fragile, with official stamps and signatures in both Chinese and English. "This belonged to my grandparents," I began, setting it gently on the table where everyone could see. "They were married in 1943, during the Japanese occupation of China. The ceremony took place in a refugee camp outside Guangzhou, with bombs falling close enough that they could hear the explosions during their vows." Patricia leaned forward, studying the document with fascination. "My goodness, it's actually held together all these years. My grandmother sewed it into the lining of her coat," I explained, along with a few other precious documents. "She said that paper could be replaced, but proof of who you were, that was irreplaceable." James picked up one of the photographs I had placed beside the certificate. "Is this them?" "Yes. That was taken about a week after their wedding. You can see the destruction behind them. Their house had been bombed 2 days earlier. They lost everything except what they could carry." Emma was staring at the photograph, perhaps seeing it clearly for the first time. In it, her great-grandparents stood amid rubble and devastation, but their posture was dignified, unbroken. Her great-grandmother's hand rested on her great-grandfather's arm, and even in the grainy black-and-white image, you could see the determination in their faces. They looked so young, Emma said softly. She was 19, he was 22. They had known each other for exactly 6 weeks. I pulled out another photograph, this one showing a crowded ship. This was taken during their journey to Hong Kong. It took them 3 months to get passage, and the boat was so overcrowded that people had to sleep in shifts. Robert studied the image intently. How did they survive something like that? They had each other, I said simply. And they had hope. My grandmother used to tell me that every morning on that ship, she would touch her wedding ring and remind herself that they weren't just escaping something, they were traveling toward their future. I reached for the genealogy scroll, unrolling it carefully on the table. The beautiful calligraphy caught the light, and I could see Patricia and James examining it with genuine awe. This shows 12 generations of our family, I explained. My father recreated it from memory after they fled China. Each name represents someone who faced impossible circumstances and found a way forward. I traced my finger along the elegant characters, translating as I went. Here's Chen Meihua, who managed the family farm during a 3-year drought when all the men were away fighting. Li Zulan, who hid refugees during the Boxer Rebellion. Zhang Weiming, who started the silk business that supported our family for 4 generations. Emma, you're part of this incredible lineage, Robert said, his voice filled with wonder. This is remarkable. For the first time all evening, I saw something shift in Emma's expression. She was looking at the scroll, not with embarrassment or impatience, but with curiosity, perhaps even pride. I never knew about most of these people, she admitted. Your great-grandmother wanted to tell you their stories when you were older, I said, but she died when you were so young. I've been waiting for the right time to share this with you. James cleared his throat. Mabel, this is extraordinary. The history, the courage it must have taken. I'm ashamed to say, I never really understood what families like yours went through to build lives in America. Every immigrant family has stories like this, I replied. We just don't always get the chance to tell them. Emma was still studying the photograph of her great-grandparents. What happened to them after they got to Hong Kong? I smiled, knowing I had finally captured her attention. That's where the real story begins, and it all centers around a simple piece of jewelry that changed everything. I excused myself and returned with the silk-lined box that had sat in my bedroom for weeks, waiting for this moment. The table fell silent as I placed it in the center, my hands resting on the lid. Emma, you've seen this bracelet many times, but you've never heard its complete story. I opened the box slowly, revealing the jade bracelet in all its simple beauty. Even in the dining room's soft lighting, the deep green stones seemed to glow with an inner light. Patricia gasped softly. It's absolutely beautiful. The color is so rich. This bracelet saved our family's life, I said, lifting it carefully from its resting place. Not once, but multiple times across multiple generations. Emma's eyes were fixed on the jade, and I could see her childhood fascination warring with her adult resistance. When your great-grandmother fled Guangzhou, she had perhaps 10 minutes to gather what she could carry. The house was burning, soldiers were in the streets, and she was pregnant with your grandmother. Most people grabbed gold, money, anything valuable that could be sold or traded. I held the bracelet up to the light, letting everyone see how the jade caught and reflected the warm glow. But Malin chose this. Do you know why? Emma shook her head, drawn into the story despite herself. Because her mother-in-law had told her something that proved to be true. This jade wasn't just jewelry, was blessed by Buddhist monks in the Forbidden City during the Qing dynasty. More than that, it had protected the women in our family through wars, famines, childbirth, and impossible journeys. James leaned forward. How could a bracelet protect someone? During the journey to Hong Kong, when your great-grandmother was giving birth to your grandmother on that overcrowded refugee ship, there were complications. No doctor, no medicine, no way to get help. The other women were afraid she wouldn't survive. I paused, making sure I had everyone's attention. Your great-grandmother was unconscious for hours, but she was clutching this bracelet. One of the older women on the ship, a midwife who had delivered hundreds of babies, said she had never seen anything like it. Every time the crisis worsened, your great-grandmother would grip the bracelet tighter, and somehow she would find the strength to continue. Mom, Emma said quietly. That's just coincidence. Maybe, I agreed. But let me tell you what happened next. When they finally reached Hong Kong, they had nothing, no money, no contacts, no way to survive. Your great-grandfather tried to find work, but refugees were everywhere, and jobs were scarce. I rotated the bracelet, showing how the jade had been carved with intricate symbols. A wealthy Chinese businessman noticed this bracelet when your great-grandmother was selling vegetables in the market. He recognized the craftsmanship, the quality of the jade, the significance of the symbols. Instead of buying it from her, he hired your great-grandfather to work in his import business. Robert was fascinated because of the bracelet, because the bracelet told him that our family came from honor, from tradition, from people who preserved what mattered most, even when they lost everything else. That job became the foundation for everything that followed: your grandmother's education, your grandfather's business, eventually our immigration to America. Patricia had tears in her eyes. So this little piece of jewelry literally changed the course of your family's life. Multiple times, I confirmed. When your grandmother married your grandfather, she wore this bracelet. When your mother was born, when I came to America, when I met your father, this bracelet was there for every major moment in our family's journey. Emma was staring at the bracelet with an expression I hadn't seen in years, wonder mixed with something that looked like recognition. The businessman in Hong Kong, she said slowly. What did he tell great-grandmother about the bracelet? I smiled, knowing I had reached the moment I had been building toward all evening. He told her that jade becomes more beautiful the longer it's worn, that it absorbs the love and strength of every woman who wears it. He said this particular piece had been blessed not just by monks, but by generations of strong women who had refused to let anything break them. I extended the bracelet toward Emma. He told her it was meant to be passed down, that its power grew stronger with each generation, and that one day it would protect and strengthen a woman who didn't even know yet how powerful she already was. Emma reached for the bracelet with trembling fingers, as if she were afraid it might disappear if she moved too quickly. When she slipped it onto her wrist, something shifted in her expression, a recognition that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. I remember this feeling, she whispered, turning her wrist to catch the light. I used to wear this when I was little, didn't I? When I was scared or sad. You did, I confirmed. You would ask for the strong lady bracelet whenever you had a difficult day at school or when you were nervous about something new. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she stared down at the jade resting against her skin. I had forgotten. I had completely forgotten. Robert moved his chair closer to hers, studying the bracelet with newfound respect. Emma, this is incredible. This is your family's history right here on your wrist. I used to know all these stories, Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. You used to tell me about great-grandmother and the ship, about grandmother hiding the papers in her coat. When did I stop listening? The question hung in the air, heavy with years of accumulated distance and misunderstanding. You didn't stop listening, I said gently. You just started hearing other voices telling you different stories about what mattered. Patricia cleared her throat softly. Emma, dear, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I think I owe you an apology. Emma looked up, surprised. When we talked about keeping the wedding sophisticated and classic, I think we may have inadvertently suggested that your heritage wasn't compatible with elegance. That was wrong of us. This evening has shown me how sophisticated and beautiful your traditions truly are. James nodded in agreement. The strength and resilience your family represents, that's exactly the kind of foundation any marriage would be lucky to build on. Emma was quiet for a long moment, still turning the bracelet on her wrist. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I've been so afraid, she admitted, afraid that if I acknowledged where I came from, people would see me differently. They would think I didn't belong in the world I've worked so hard to enter. And now, I asked. Emma looked around the table at Robert's parents, both of whom were watching her with expressions of genuine warmth and respect. She looked at Robert, whose eyes were filled with love and admiration. Finally, she looked at me. Now, I'm afraid I've been dishonoring the very women who made my success possible. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. They wouldn't see it as dishonor, sweetheart. They would see it as adaptation, as survival, as doing what you needed to do to thrive in a new world. But they would also want you to remember that your strength comes from them. Emma pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her photos. Look, she said, showing us a picture from her college graduation. I can see it now. Look at my posture. My expression. I look exactly like great-grandmother in that photograph from the refugee camp. Robert leaned over to look. You do. The same determination, the same dignity. I've been carrying their strength all along, Emma said with wonder. I just convinced myself it was something to hide instead of something to celebrate. As the evening continued, Emma asked question after question about our family's history, about traditions she had forgotten, about the meaning behind customs she had dismissed. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing years of suppressed curiosity and pride. For the first time in years, I saw my daughter, Claire Lanotte, the woman who had learned to navigate American society by minimizing her differences, but the strong, proud descendant of remarkable women who had overcome impossible odds. As the evening wound down, James Whitmore pulled out his own wallet and extracted a worn business card. Mabel, I have to share something with you. This conversation tonight, it's reminded me of my own family's story. He handed me the card, yellowed with age, and printed in both English and Italian. My grandfather's first business card when he arrived in New York in 1923. He couldn't speak English, had $8 in his pocket, and faced discrimination every day because of his Italian accent and Catholic faith. Patricia nodded. James rarely talks about this, but his family went through many of the same struggles yours did, different circumstances, but the same courage required to start over in a new country. I built my business on international partnerships, James continued. Some of my most successful ventures have been with Chinese companies. I've traveled to Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong dozens of times. The work ethic, the respect for family, the long-term thinking, these are values I deeply admire. He turned to Emma, his expression serious but kind. What your mother has shared tonight, this isn't something to minimize or hide from. This is something that should make you incredibly proud. Emma was still wearing the jade bracelet, and I noticed she hadn't stopped touching it throughout the conversation. Mr. Whitmore, I think I've been making a mistake. I've been so focused on fitting in that I forgot what makes me unique might actually be valuable. More than valuable, Patricia interjected. Essential. Robert, tell them about the conversation we had last week. Robert looked slightly embarrassed, but smiled. My parents were talking about what they admired most about Emma. Mom said it was her resilience, how she approaches challenges with this quiet determination that never gives up. Dad said it was her ability to see problems from different angles, to find solutions that other people miss. Exactly, James said. And now I understand where those qualities come from. They're not just personality traits, they're inherited strengths passed down through generations of remarkable women. Patricia reached across the table to touch Emma's hand. Dear, when we talked about sophistication and elegance for your wedding, we were thinking far too narrowly. True elegance comes from authenticity, from honoring what makes you who you are. Actually, James said, I've been thinking about the wedding plans. Emma, what would you say to incorporating some of these traditions, not because you have to, but because they're beautiful and meaningful? Emma's eyes widened. You would be interested in that. We would be honored, Patricia said firmly. This bracelet, the tea ceremony, the stories behind your family's journey, these things don't detract from elegance. They add depth and meaning that most weddings lack. Robert squeezed Emma's hand. I've been hoping you would want to include some Chinese traditions. I was just afraid to ask because you seemed so set on the Western ceremony. You were afraid to ask. Emma looked stunned. I want our wedding to represent both of us, Robert said. Your heritage is part of who you are, and who you are is exactly who I fell in love with. As I watched this conversation unfold, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the acceptance Robert's family was showing, but for the possibility that Emma was finally ready to embrace all of herself, the American woman she had become and the Chinese daughter she had always been. The bridge between our two worlds was finally being built, and it was stronger than I had ever dared to hope. After Robert's family left that evening, Emma lingered in my kitchen, helping me wash the dishes in comfortable silence. She still wore the jade bracelet, and I noticed how naturally she had begun incorporating it into her movements, the way she held her wrist while drying a plate, how she touched it when she was thinking. Mom, she finally said, setting down the dish towel and turning to face me fully. I need to apologize to you, Emma. You don't need to. Yes, I do. Her voice was firm but gentle. I said terrible things to you. I told you that our heritage was too Asian for my wedding, and that was not only hurtful, it was wrong. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse, a letter she had apparently written during the dinner conversation. I started writing this while you were telling the story about great-grandmother. I needed to get my thoughts down before I lost my courage. I took the letter, recognizing Emma's careful handwriting on the expensive stationery she used for important correspondence. Dear Mom, I read aloud. I realize now that when I said your traditions were too Asian for my wedding, what I was really saying was that I was too ashamed to be your daughter. I looked up at Emma, who was crying silently. Keep reading, she whispered. I was wrong. Being your daughter, being the descendant of women who survived wars, crossed oceans, and built new lives with nothing but determination and love, that's not something to hide from, it's something to celebrate. I have spent so many years trying to become someone else that I forgot how amazing it is to be exactly who I am. I set the letter down and pulled Emma into my arms, feeling her shoulders shake as years of accumulated pain and misunderstanding finally found their release. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I made you feel like your love wasn't good enough, like your traditions weren't valuable, like being Chinese was something I needed to overcome rather than something that made me strong. Oh, sweetheart, I murmured, stroking her hair the way I had when she was small and needed comfort. I'm sorry I didn't find a better way to help you understand that you could be both American and Chinese, successful and connected to your roots. We stood there in my kitchen, holding each other, and I felt something healing that had been broken for longer than I had realized. The bracelet, Emma said, pulling back to look at me. I want to wear it at the wedding. Not hidden under my dress, but proudly. I want everyone to see it. Are you sure? What about the aesthetic you and Robert planned? Emma smiled through her tears. The aesthetic we planned was beautiful, but it wasn't complete. It wasn't me. I want our wedding to tell the whole story, his family's traditions and ours, the past and the future, everything that makes us who we are. For the first time in months, I felt truly hopeful about my daughter's wedding day. The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of revised wedding plans and rediscovered traditions. Emma threw herself into learning about Chinese wedding customs, with the same intensity she had once applied to erasing them from her celebration. We spent an entire Saturday shopping in Chinatown, something we hadn't done together in years. Emma marveled at the bolts of red silk, the intricate embroidery, the symbols she was seeing with new eyes. At a small shop tucked between a dim sum restaurant and an herb store, we found the perfect Kipawa traditional Chinese dress in deep red silk with delicate gold threading. I can't believe I never appreciated how beautiful this is, Emma said, running her fingers over the intricate phoenix embroidery. The dress was elegant and sophisticated, but unmistakably Chinese in its design and symbolism. The shop owner, an elderly woman who had known my mother, smiled as she took Emma's measurements. Your grandmother would be so proud, she told Emma, in accented English. She used to talk about you all the time, about how you would carry on the traditions. We also planned a tea ceremony to precede the Western ceremony, a moment for both families to formally acknowledge the joining of two households. Robert enthusiastically participated in learning the proper movements, the significance of serving tea to elders, the respect embedded in every gesture. I love that every action has meaning, he told me during one of our practice sessions. In my family's traditions, we have rituals too, but they've become so automatic that we sometimes forget why we do them. Emma researched the symbolism behind every element we would incorporate. The double happiness symbols that would decorate the tea ceremony table represented joy multiplied by the union of two lives. The red candles symbolized good fortune and the hope for children. The dates, peanuts, and lotus seeds served during the ceremony each carried wishes for the couple's future early birth of sons, longevity, and many offspring. I want to understand everything, Emma said one evening as we practiced the tea-pouring ceremony in my living room. I spent so many years dismissing these traditions without even knowing what they meant. The fusion of traditions proved more beautiful than either of us had imagined. Emma's florist worked with us to incorporate red accents into the white rose arrangements, not as an afterthought, but as an intentional celebration of Emma's dual heritage. The wedding invitations were reprinted with a delicate double happiness symbol embossed in gold, elegant enough to satisfy Patricia's aesthetic standards while honoring our cultural significance. Robert's family embraced the changes with enthusiasm that touched me deeply. James researched Chinese business customs and learned to properly address my elderly relatives. Patricia asked thoughtful questions about the meaning behind each tradition, taking notes like a diligent student. I'm learning so much, Patricia told me during one of our planning sessions. I had no idea how thoughtful and symbolic Chinese weddings are. Every element seems designed to bring the families together and bless the couple's future. The most meaningful moment came when Emma asked me to teach her the traditional songs my mother had sung during my own tea ceremony. We sat at my piano, Emma learning the Mandarin words phonetically while I explained their meaning. This song is about a daughter leaving her birth family to join her husband's family, I explained. But it's not about loss, it's about growth, about becoming a bridge between two worlds. Emma practiced the song until she could sing it from memory, her pronunciation careful and respectful. Hearing those ancient words in her voice felt like watching a circle complete itself. The traditions that had sustained our family through war and displacement and uncertainty were being passed forward to another generation. Transformed but unbroken. The night before the wedding, Emma wore the jade bracelet to the rehearsal dinner, answering questions about its history with pride and joy that made my heart swell with happiness. The morning of Emma's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of golden light that photographers dream of and mothers interpret as blessings from heaven. I arrived at the hotel suite early to help Emma prepare, carrying the red silk kipao in a garment bag and the jade bracelet in its familiar silk-lined box. Emma was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, wearing the simple white robe the hotel had provided. When she saw me, her face lit up with a smile that reminded me of the little girl who had once been so proud to wear red silk to school. "I've been thinking about great-grandmother all morning," she said, standing to embrace me, "about how she must have felt on her wedding day in a refugee camp, not knowing what the future would hold." "She would be so proud of you," I said, setting down the garment bag, "not just because you're successful, but because you found your way back to who you are." The morning passed in a beautiful blur of preparation. Emma's bridesmaids helped her into the white wedding gown, first a stunning creation of silk and lace that made her look like a princess from a fairy tale. But when it came time for the tea ceremony, she changed into the red kipao, and the transformation was breathtaking. The deep red silk brought out the warmth in her skin, and the gold embroidery caught the light as she moved. But more than that, she carried herself differently in the traditional dress, with a dignity and grace that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her heritage. "Oh my goodness," Patricia breathed when she saw Emma in the kipao. "You look absolutely magnificent." I fastened the jade bracelet around Emma's wrist, the same ritual that had been performed for generations of women in our family. As the cool stone settled against her skin, Emma closed her eyes for a moment, as if drawing strength from all the women who had worn it before her. The tea ceremony took place in a small garden pavilion beside the main reception venue, decorated with red silk banners bearing double happiness symbols. Both families gathered in a circle, with Emma and Robert at the center. Kneeling before representatives from each generation, Emma served tea to Robert's grandparents first, offering the cups with both hands in the traditional gesture of respect. Her movements were graceful and confident, and when Robert's grandmother accepted the tea and offered a blessing for their marriage, Emma's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. When it was my turn to receive tea from my daughter, I felt the weight of every generation that had led to this moment. Emma knelt before me, offering the cup with steady hands, and I saw in her face the same strength that had carried our family through wars and oceans and the uncertainty of new beginnings. "Thank you," I whispered as I accepted the tea, "for remembering who you are." Robert participated in the ceremony with genuine reverence, serving tea to my elderly aunts and uncles who had traveled from across the country to witness this moment. When my Aunt Helen, my mother's last surviving sister, placed her weathered hands on Robert's head and blessed their union in Mandarin, there wasn't a dry eye in the pavilion. The transition from the tea ceremony to the Western wedding was seamless and beautiful. Emma changed back into her white gown, but she kept the jade bracelet on, visible and proud against her skin. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, my brother who had flown in from Seattle, I saw heads turning to admire not just her beauty, but the confident way she carried herself. During the ceremony, when the minister spoke about marriage as the joining of two families and two traditions, Emma and Robert exchanged a look of perfect understanding. Their vows included references to building bridges between worlds, to honoring the past while creating the future, to drawing strength from their different backgrounds to create something new and beautiful together. When Robert slipped the wedding ring onto Emma's finger, it rested perfectly beside the jade bracelet old and new, east and west, tradition and innovation existing in perfect harmony. The reception that followed was a true celebration of fusion. Traditional Chinese dishes were served alongside classic American fare. The wedding cake was decorated with both roses and peonies, both Western elegance and Eastern symbolism. But the most meaningful moment came during Emma's speech, when she stood before all our gathered family and friends, wearing her white dress and her jade bracelet, and told the story of the remarkable women who had made this day possible. 6 months after the wedding, Emma called me with news that made my heart leap with joy. She and Robert were expecting their first child, and she wanted to share the news in person. When she arrived at my house that afternoon, she was carrying a small gift bag and wearing the jade bracelet, which had become a permanent part of her jewelry collection. "Mom," she said, settling onto my sofa with a radiant smile, "we wanted you to be the first to know. We're having a baby." I cried. Of course, there's a pure happiness for the continuation of our family line and the promise of new traditions being born. But Emma wasn't finished with her surprises. From the gift bag, she pulled out a tiny pair of red silk baby shoes, embroidered with golden dragons. "I found these in the same shop where we bought my kipo," she explained. "I wanted to start the baby's collection of meaningful things early." I held the impossibly small shoes in my hands, marveling at the intricate workmanship and the hope they represented. "These are beautiful, sweetheart. I've been thinking a lot about what we want to teach our child," Emma continued, "about family, about heritage, about being proud of all the different pieces that make us who we are." She touched the jade bracelet thoughtfully. "I want our baby to grow up knowing the stories you told that night at dinner. I want them to understand that they come from people who survived impossible things, who built new lives with courage and love. And I want them to know," she added with a smile, "that being multicultural isn't something to overcome, it's something that makes them stronger, more adaptable, more capable of building bridges between different worlds." Over the following months, Emma threw herself into learning about child-rearing traditions from both cultures. She researched the meaning behind Chinese naming customs, the significance of the red eggs that would celebrate the baby's 1-month birthday, the protective symbols that would decorate the nursery. But she also maintained her appreciation for the American traditions she had grown up with, planning a baby shower, researching pediatricians, preparing for the modern realities of working parenthood in contemporary America. "I used to think I had to choose," she told me during one of our shopping trips for baby items. "Chinese or American, traditional or modern, your way or my way. But now I understand that the choice isn't either or, it's both." And the nursery they created reflected this understanding perfectly. A modern crib sat beside a traditional Chinese blessing scroll. Contemporary baby monitors shared space with red silk protective charms. Western children's books filled the shelves alongside Chinese picture books that would teach their child the language of their ancestors. As I write this, my grandchild is 6 months old, a beautiful baby who will grow up bilingual, and proud of the rich heritage that flows through their veins. Emma has already started a tradition of her own, photographing the baby wearing the jade bracelet during each monthly milestone, creating a visual record of how the ancient traditions continue to bless new generations. The bridge between worlds that Emma and I struggled to build has become the foundation for a new generation that will never have to choose between who they are and who they want to become. They will be both, beautifully and completely, carrying forward the strength of their ancestors while writing their own chapter in our family's continuing story.